Working the night shift at the old convenience store on the outskirts of town was supposed to be easy money. Customers were rare after midnight, and the biggest threats were drunken teens looking for snacks or the occasional busted coffee machine. For Aaron, a recent college dropout with bills to pay, it was the perfect gig. At least that's what he told himself. The store was located along Route 9, surrounded by nothing but dense woods and the eerie hum of cicadas. A single, flickering street lamp out front did little to dispel the oppressive darkness. Most people avoided the area after sundown, but the store had been around for decades, a relic of a time when travelers still passed through. Now, the only signs of life were the buzzing neon open sign and Aaron's half-hearted attempt to stay awake behind the counter. It started as a typical night. The clock on the wall read 2:13 a.m., and Aaron was scrolling aimlessly on his phone, occasionally glancing at the security monitors out of boredom. 3 small black and white screens showed the empty aisles, the parking lot, and the narrow stretch of woods behind the building. Then, the first sign of unease, a faint knock on the glass door. Aaron looked up, startled. A man stood just outside the store, his face obscured by shadows. He wasn't moving, just standing there, his silhouette outlined by the flickering street lamp. Aaron hesitated, unsure if the man was waiting to come in or if he was lost. "Hey, we're open," Aaron called out, his voice echoing in the empty space. The man didn't respond. Instead, he tilted his head as though trying to get a better look at Aaron. A chill ran down his spine. Something about the man's posture was wrong. He stood too still, unnaturally so, like a statue. Aaron stepped closer to the door, his hand hovering near the lock. "You okay, man? Need something?" Without warning, the man turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness of the parking lot. Aaron exhaled, shaking his head. Just some weirdo, he thought. Probably a drifter passing through. He locked the door anyway, just in case. Returning to his spot behind the counter, Aaron tried to shake the unease gnawing at him. But the store felt different now, heavier somehow. He glanced at the monitors. The aisles were still empty. The parking lot, still dark. But on the third screen, something caught his eye. A shadow moved along the edge of the woods. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a figure darting between the trees. Aaron leaned closer, squinting at the grainy image. For a moment, the shadow stopped at the tree line, just barely visible. Then it stepped forward into the open, and Aaron's stomach dropped. It was the man from the door. Only now, Aaron could see him clearly. His face was pale and expressionless, his eyes black pits that seemed to absorb the light. He wasn't walking anymore. He was crawling, his limbs bending unnaturally as he dragged himself closer to the building. Aaron scrambled to his feet, knocking over his chair in the process. He fumbled for his phone, dialing 911 with shaking hands. The operator picked up, but before Aaron could speak, the power went out. The store was plunged into complete darkness, the only light coming from his phone screen. The hum of the fridge and the buzzing neon sign were gone, replaced by a suffocating silence. Aaron's breath came in shallow gasps as he turned on his flashlight, sweeping it across the store. "Hello?" he called out, his voice trembling. The faint sound of shuffling came from the back of the store. No, Aaron whispered, backing away. He pointed the light toward the source of the noise, but the aisles were empty. He turned toward the monitors, but they were dead, static filling the screens. Then he heard it, a low, guttural growl, so close it felt like it was coming from inside his own chest. Aaron turned and saw the man, or what used to be a man, standing at the end of the aisle. His body was twisted and contorted, his mouth hanging open in a grotesque grin. Black, viscous fluid dripped from his eyes, pooling on the floor. Aaron ran. He sprinted toward the front door, fumbling with the lock. His hands were slick with sweat and the keys clattered to the floor. Behind him, the growling grew louder, accompanied by the sound of wet footsteps. He didn't dare look back. Finally, the door clicked open and Aaron burst into the night, his legs carrying him toward the main road. He didn't stop running until he reached the gas station a mile down the road, collapsing in front of the startled attendant. The police arrived 20 minutes later, but when they searched the convenience store, it was empty. No sign of the man. No black fluid, not even the keys Aaron had dropped. The officers chalked it up to exhaustion or a prank, but Aaron knew better. He quit the job the next day, leaving town without a word. The store remains open to this day, still lit by that flickering street lamp. Travelers passing through occasionally report strange sightings, but no one stays long enough to investigate. And somewhere in the woods behind the building, The man waits, his black eyes watching, his twisted smile growing wider with every passing night.
Story number 2.
When Laura took the security job at the abandoned textile factory, it seemed like a simple enough gig. She needed money, and the promise of double pay for night shifts was too good to pass up. The factory had been shut down for years, a casualty of outsourcing and neglect. But the owners insisted on maintaining a security presence to deter vandals and squatters. Her first night was quiet, almost too quiet. The factory was massive, a labyrinth of dusty hallways and cavernous rooms filled with rusting machinery. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of settling metal or the distant echo of dripping water. Laura carried a flashlight and a walkie-talkie, though she was the only guard on duty. The security office at the front of the building had a small desk, a coffee pot, and a bank of outdated security monitors that barely worked. Most of the cameras were grainy or stuck on static, but it didn't bother her. She didn't expect trouble. It was during her second patrol, around 1:30 a.m., when she heard the sound. At first, it was faint, like the whisper of fabric brushing against metal. Laura paused in the main corridor, her flashlight sweeping across the rows of old sewing machines. The sound came again, louder this time, like someone dragging their feet across the concrete floor. "Hello?" She called out, her voice echoing in the vast space. No response. She tightened her grip on the flashlight and moved toward the source of the noise. Her boots echoed with each step, but the dragging sound had stopped. She turned a corner and found herself in the dye room, where large vats of rusted machinery loomed like forgotten sentinels. The air was damp and carried a faint metallic tang. "Anyone here? You're trespassing," she said, trying to sound authoritative. Then, from behind one of the vats, she heard it, a low, guttural moan. Her heart pounded as she approached, her flashlight trembling in her hand. She rounded the corner, expecting to find some vagrant or thrill-seeking teenager. Instead, there was nothing, just an empty space and the slow drip of water from a leaky pipe. Laura exhaled shakily and turned to leave. That's when she saw it, a handprint on the wall, smeared in dark red. Her breath caught in her throat. The print was fresh, the edges glistening in the dim light. She instinctively raised the walkie-talkie to call for help, but the line was filled with static. "Great," she muttered, backing away from the wall. As she turned to leave the dye room, the dragging sound returned, only now it was coming from the direction she had just been. Her flashlight flickered, casting jagged shadows that danced across the walls. "Stay calm, Laura," she whispered to herself. She quickened her pace, moving back toward the main corridor. But no matter how fast she walked, the sound followed her, growing louder with each step. It wasn't just dragging anymore. It was accompanied by a wet, sloshing noise, like something heavy being dragged through water. When she reached the security office, she slammed the door shut and locked it. Her hands were shaking as she fumbled to check the monitors. Most of the screens showed nothing but static, but one, the camera overlooking the dye room, flickered to life. Laura stared at the screen, her pulse racing. The camera was pointed at the wall where she had seen the handprint, but now there was something else. A figure stood in the center of the room, hunched and grotesque. Its skin was pallid and stretched tight over its bones, its mouth an impossibly wide grin that revealed rows of jagged, uneven teeth. Black fluid dripped from its elongated fingers as it slowly turned its head toward the camera. Then it moved. It didn't walk. It didn't run. It scuttled like an insect, its limbs bending at unnatural angles as it scrambled toward the camera. Laura's stomach churned as the screen filled with static again. The walkie-talkie crackled to life and a voice whispered through the static, "Get out!" Laura didn't need to be told twice. She grabbed her keys and bolted out of the security office, her flashlight barely illuminating the path ahead. She ran down the corridor, the sound of dragging and scuttling echoing behind her. The exit was just ahead, the glowing red exit sign a beacon of hope. But as she reached for the door, it slammed shut on its own. A low growl resonated through the air, and Laura turned to see the figure standing at the end of the hallway. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle, its black eyes gleaming with malice. It started toward her, its movements jerky and erratic. Panicking, Laura yanked at the door, her fingers slipping on the handle. Finally, it gave way, and she burst outside, collapsing onto the pavement. She scrambled to her car, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. As she sped away, she glanced in the rearview mirror. The factory loomed in the distance, its broken windows like empty eye sockets. But in one of them, she saw it. The figure watching her, its grin impossibly wide. Laura quit the job the next morning. She didn't tell anyone what happened, but rumors spread quickly. People talked about the cursed factory and the strange occurrences at night. No one else took the job. The factory remains abandoned. But on quiet nights, passersby claim to hear the faint sound of dragging footsteps and low, guttural moans. And those who dare to look inside swear they see a figure waiting in the shadows, its grin etched into their nightmares.
Story number 3.
It was supposed to be an uneventful night. Ryan had worked late at the office, and by the time he left, the streets were nearly deserted. The city subway was the fastest way home, even at this hour. The only downside was that the last train was infamous for its eerie emptiness. He jogged down the cracked steps into the subway station, the fluorescent lights above him flickering weakly. The air was damp and cold, carrying the faint smell of mildew and oil. The platform was almost entirely deserted, save for an old man slumped on a bench, his face hidden beneath the brim of a tattered hat. Ryan checked his watch. 12:47 a.m. The last train was due in 3 minutes. He leaned against a pillar, scrolling through his phone to pass the time. The sound of distant footsteps echoed through the tunnel, faint but distinct. When the train finally arrived, it screeched to a halt with an ear-piercing wail of brakes. The doors hissed open, revealing a dimly lit interior. Ryan hesitated. The train looked older than he remembered, its seats cracked and its windows grimy. He shrugged it off, stepped inside, and took a seat near the door. As the train pulled away, he noticed something odd. The old man from the platform was nowhere to be seen. Ryan frowned. He had been right there. The train was silent except for the rhythmic clatter of wheels on tracks. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting a sickly yellow glow. Ryan glanced around. The car was empty, save for a young woman sitting at the far end. She had her back to him, her long black hair cascading over her shoulders. He tried to shake off the unease creeping over him. He pulled out his phone again, but couldn't get a signal. Typical, he thought, stuffing it back into his pocket. Minutes passed, and Ryan became acutely aware of how slow the train was moving. The tunnels outside were pitch black, no signs or lights passing by. The rhythmic sound of the tracks began to change, the steady pattern shifting into something uneven and disjointed. Then he noticed the woman. She hadn't moved, not once. Her posture was unnaturally stiff, her head tilted slightly to one side as though listening for something. Ryan cleared his throat, hoping to break the oppressive silence. "Hey, do you know how long this train takes to get to 32nd Street? No response. "Miss?" The woman slowly turned her head. Ryan's stomach dropped. Her face was pale, almost translucent, with deep black pits where her eyes should have been. Her mouth was stitched shut with thick, dark thread, and her head jerked unnaturally as she shifted toward him. Ryan shot to his feet, his heart pounding. The woman's neck cracked audibly as she stood, her movements twitchy and inhuman. "Stay back!" he shouted, backing toward the door. The train lurched violently, throwing him off balance. He grabbed onto a pole to steady himself, but when he looked back, the woman was gone. The car was empty. Ryan's breath came in short gasps as he scanned the space. There was nowhere she could have gone. The doors between cars were locked, and the windows showed nothing but endless black. Then the lights began to flicker. Each time they went out, the car was plunged into darkness for a split second. And each time they came back on, Ryan saw glimpses of her, closer and closer. Her head tilted, her stitched mouth twisting into an unnatural smile. Panicking, Ryan bolted for the emergency brake. He yanked it with all his strength, but nothing happened. The train continued its relentless crawl through the blackness. A soft, wet sound behind him made him freeze. He turned slowly, his stomach churning. The woman was inches away, her eyeless sockets boring into him. Her stitched mouth began to tremble, the threads straining as if something inside her was trying to break free. Then she opened her mouth. The stitches snapped with a sickening tear, and a deafening scream erupted from her, a sound so raw and inhuman it made Ryan's ears ring. He stumbled backward, slamming against the locked door. The woman lunged at him, her skeletal hands clawing at his face. Desperate, Ryan kicked out, knocking her back. She hit the floor with a guttural hiss, her body twitching violently. The lights flickered again, and in the brief flashes of illumination, Ryan saw them. More figures, dozens of them, crammed into the car. their pale, eyeless faces and twisted grins fixed on him. They stood motionless, blocking every exit. The train began to slow, the screech of brakes filling the air. Ryan's chest tightened with a flicker of hope. If he could just get out, he could run, find someone, escape. The train came to a halt, and the doors slid open with a groan. But outside wasn't a platform. It was an endless void, a churning sea of darkness that seemed to pulse with life. The figures began to move, their heads jerking as they turned toward the open door. Ryan screamed as they surged forward, their cold hands dragging him out of the car and into the abyss. The last thing he saw before the darkness consumed him was the train pulling away, its flickering lights disappearing into the void. The next morning, the train arrived at the final station on its route. It was empty, save for a single phone lying on the seat, and the faint sound of whispers coming from the tunnels.
Story number 4.
Emma hated living in the countryside. Her parents had dragged her out here after her father's job forced them to relocate, and their isolated new home, an aging farmhouse surrounded by miles of empty fields, felt like a prison. The nearest neighbor was over a mile away, and the town was barely more than a gas station and a diner. The nights were the worst. Without city lights, the darkness was absolute, pressing against her bedroom window like a suffocating blanket. Her parents had laughed off her complaints, telling her to enjoy the peace and quiet, but there was nothing peaceful about it. Not when the house creaked and groaned like it was alive. It started 2 weeks after they moved in. Emma was lying in bed, scrolling through her phone with the faint glow of the screen, the only light in the room. She heard it first, a soft tap on the glass. Tap. She froze. It was faint, almost imperceptible, like a tree branch brushing against the window. Except there were no trees near her room, just an open field that stretched into the horizon. Tap. Tap. Her heart pounded as she slowly turned her head toward the window. The blinds were drawn, but the tapping continued, steady and deliberate. Summoning her courage, Emma got out of bed and inched toward the window, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. She reached out, hesitated, then pulled the blinds open in one swift motion. Nothing. Just her reflection staring back at her, wide-eyed and pale. The field beyond was empty, bathed in the faint silver glow of the moon. She let out a shaky laugh, feeling silly for scaring herself, and climbed back into bed. The next morning, she noticed something strange. Outside her window, in the dirt beneath the sill, were footprints. They were deep, as though someone had stood there for hours, and they led off into the field before disappearing. Probably just some animal, her father said when she showed him. Foxes, maybe. But the footprints were human. That night, Emma locked her window and pulled the blinds tightly shut. She even pushed her desk chair against the sill, as if that could somehow keep out whatever had been there. She lay in bed for hours, staring at the ceiling, listening for the sound of tapping. It didn't come. Instead, at exactly 2:37 a.m., she woke to the sound of footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, crunching through the gravel driveway outside. Emma held her breath, her pulse racing. She didn't dare move, her eyes fixed on the sliver of light beneath her door. The footsteps stopped just outside her window. Then came the tapping. Tap. Tap. Emma clutched her blanket tightly, her body paralyzed with fear. Tap. Her phone was on the nightstand. Slowly she reached for it, her fingers trembling. She turned on the camera and set it to video mode. Without moving the blanket away, she pointed the phone toward the window and pressed record. The tapping continued for a few agonizing minutes before finally stopping. Emma waited, her entire body rigid, until the first rays of dawn crept into her room. Only then did she check her phone. The video showed her darkened room, the blinds pulled tightly shut over the window. But as the seconds ticked by, something appeared, a shadow moving across the blinds. It wasn't the shape of a man or an animal. It was long and angular, its limbs too thin, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Then it leaned closer, its featureless face pressing against the blinds. The screen went black. Emma showed the video to her parents, but they dismissed it as a prank or a trick of the light. Her protests fell on deaf ears, and they refused to let her sleep in their room. That night, she barricaded her door with her dresser and kept every light in her room on. She sat on her bed with her back to the wall, clutching a flashlight and waiting. At exactly 2:37 a.m., the footsteps came again. They were louder this time, circling the house, pausing occasionally beneath her window. Emma's hands shook as she clutched the flashlight, aiming it at the door. She didn't know what she expected, a pounding maybe, or the sound of the knob turning. But nothing happened. Then the tapping started. It was different now. Instead of the rhythmic tap, 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 it was erratic, frantic, as though whatever was outside was trying to claw its way in. Suddenly, the lights in her room flickered. "No, no, no," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own heartbeat. The lights went out, plunging her into darkness. The tapping stopped. For a moment there was silence. Then came a low, guttural voice from just outside the window. "Emma, let me in." Her scream died in her throat as the sound of glass shattering filled the room. The last thing she saw before the darkness closed in was a pair of impossibly long arms reaching for her, pulling her into the cold night. When her parents found her room the next morning, the window was broken, the chair and desk toppled over, the blinds were shredded, and Emma was gone. All that remained were footprints in the dirt, leading away from the house and vanishing into the empty field. Some nights her parents claimed to hear the tapping, but they never opened the blinds.
Story number 5.
Lena had always hated her grandmother's house. It was old, drafty, and filled with things that felt like they belonged in a museum. Porcelain dolls with glassy, unblinking eyes, faded photographs of long-dead relatives, and a grandfather clock that ticked just a little too loudly in the dead of night. When her grandmother passed, Lena was tasked with cleaning out the house. She tried to put it off, but the lawyer handling the estate insisted it needed to be done before the house could be sold. She arrived on a Friday evening, planning to stay the weekend and finish the job quickly. The house was just as she remembered it, silent and heavy with the scent of mothballs and dust. By nightfall, the house seemed to come alive. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the old pipes sounded like whispers in the dark. But Lena ignored it. She wasn't a kid anymore. She didn't believe in ghosts. She set up her sleeping bag in the living room, unwilling to sleep in her grandmother's bedroom. It was around midnight when she first heard the sound, a faint, rhythmic tapping like someone gently knocking on wood. Lena froze, her eyes darting to the front door. But it wasn't coming from there. It was coming from the stairs. Tap, tap, tap. She swallowed hard, telling herself it was just the house settling. But the sound was too deliberate, too precise. She shone her flashlight toward the staircase. The beam of light caught the edge of the banister and the steps leading upward, but there was nothing there. Tap. The sound came again, louder this time. It wasn't random, it was coming closer. Lena's heart raced as she scanned the stairs with the flashlight. She strained her ears, listening for any other noise, but the house had gone deathly silent. Then she saw it. A shadow moved across the staircase. It wasn't cast by her flashlight. It moved independently, sliding along the wall like smoke. It paused halfway down, stretching unnaturally, its form shifting and twisting. "Who's there?" Lena called out, her voice trembling. The shadow didn't respond. Instead, it began to descend, step by step, the tapping growing louder with each movement. Lena stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the coffee table. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911, but the call wouldn't connect. The screen was stuck on the dialing screen, the signal bar eerily empty. Tap. The shadow reached the bottom of the stairs, pooling on the floor like ink. Then slowly it began to rise, taking shape. A figure emerged, tall and impossibly thin, its face obscured by darkness. Its arms were too long, its fingers ending in sharp, jagged points. It didn't speak. It didn't make a sound. It simply stared at her, or at least she thought it was staring. Lena bolted for the door, yanking it open and running into the night. She didn't stop until she reached her car, her hands shaking so badly it took 3 tries to get the key in the ignition. When she finally looked back at the house, the shadow was there, standing in the doorway. It didn't chase her. It just stood there, watching. She never went back. When the lawyer asked why she had left without finishing, she made up some excuse about being too busy. The house was eventually sold to a young couple. A month later, Lena saw a news article about the new owners. They had disappeared without a trace. The only clue was a single message scrawled on the wall in what looked like soot. It watches.
Story number 6.
Tom had always been a night owl, which made working late shifts at the small-town radio station perfect for him. The job was mostly uneventful, just playing pre-recorded music and reading the occasional weather update or local news bulletin. The station's signal didn't reach far, and the audience was small, but Tom didn't mind. It was quiet, solitary work. The studio was located on the outskirts of town, surrounded by dense woods and accessible by a single winding road. The building itself was old, with creaky floors and a faint smell of mildew. Most of the equipment was outdated, but it got the job done. One night, during a lull in the broadcast, Tom decided to take a break. He grabbed a cup of coffee and settled into his chair, scrolling through his phone. That's when the static started. It was faint at first, just a soft crackle that he assumed was interference from one of the older machines. But then it grew louder, drowning out the music playing on the air. Tom frowned and checked the controls. Everything seemed normal, but the static persisted, a low, grating hiss that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He adjusted the dials, trying to isolate the source of the interference, and then he heard it. A voice, faint and distorted, hidden beneath the static. Tom. He froze, staring at the control board. The voice was low and guttural, barely audible, but it unmistakably said his name. "Hello?" he said, his voice shaky. The static responded, crackling angrily before fading into silence. Tom leaned back in his chair, his heart racing. Maybe it was a prank, he thought. Someone messing with the signal. He decided to brush it off and get back to work. But then the lights flickered. The overhead fluorescents buzzed loudly, their glow dimming before stabilizing. Tom looked around the studio, his unease growing. A loud thud echoed through the building. It came from the front door. Tom hesitated before standing, his coffee forgotten on the desk. He walked slowly to the door, his footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. Peering through the small window, he saw nothing but the dark outline of the trees beyond. Another thud. This time it came from the roof. Tom jumped, his breath quickening. He backed away from the door, his eyes darting toward the ceiling. The sound was heavy, deliberate, like something walking across the roof. And then, all at once, it stopped. The studio was deathly silent, the air thick with tension. Tom hurried back to the control room, locking the door behind him. The static returned louder now, filling the room like a living thing. "Tom," the voice was clearer this time, and it wasn't coming from the speakers. It was coming from behind him. Tom spun around, his eyes wide with terror. A figure stood in the corner of the room, barely visible in the dim light. Its body was made entirely of static, shimmering, shifting black and white patterns that buzzed and hissed like a broken TV screen. Its face was featureless, except for two dark voids where its eyes should have been. "Tom," it said again, the word distorted and wrong. Tom backed away, his hand fumbling for the door handle, but the figure didn't move. It simply stood there, its head tilting unnaturally to one side. "Why are you here?" Tom whispered, his voice barely audible. The static man didn't answer. Instead, the lights flickered violently, plunging the room into darkness. When the lights came back on, the figure was gone. Tom didn't hesitate. He grabbed his keys and ran, leaving the station behind. He didn't care if he got fired. He wasn't staying another second in that place. The next morning, the station manager called him, furious about the dead air that had lasted for hours after Tom left. But when the manager checked the overnight recording logs, he found something chilling. The broadcast hadn't gone silent. Instead, the static had continued, uninterrupted. And beneath it, faint but unmistakable, was a voice repeating the same message over and over. "Tom, you can't run."
Story number 7.
When Sarah moved into the old Victorian house, she knew it needed work. The realtor had been upfront about the repairs, creaky floors, drafty windows, and the occasional leaky pipe, but the price was too good to pass up. The house had been abandoned for years, and Sarah relished the idea of restoring it to its former glory. She spent the first few days cleaning and unpacking, exploring the nooks and crannies of her new home. One afternoon, while sorting through the attic, she found something strange. At the far end of the room, hidden behind a stack of dusty furniture, was a door she hadn't noticed before. It was small, almost child-sized, with peeling paint and a rusted handle. Curious, Sarah tried to open it, but the door wouldn't budge. It felt like it was sealed shut, and there was no keyhole. She decided to leave it for later, thinking it was probably just a forgotten storage space. That night, she heard the knocking. It was faint at first, a soft, rhythmic tap that seemed to echo through the house. Sarah assumed it was just the old pipes, but as the night went on, the sound grew louder, more deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the attic. Her stomach tightened as she climbed the stairs, flashlight in hand. The attic was cold, the air heavy with the smell of mildew. She scanned the room, but nothing seemed out of place. Then she saw the door. It was open. Sarah froze, her heart pounding. The door she had been unable to budge earlier now stood ajar, revealing a narrow, pitch-black passageway. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. There was no response, just the faint sound of something shifting in the darkness beyond the door. Against her better judgment, Sarah stepped closer, shining her flashlight into the opening. The beam illuminated a small, cramped room with walls covered in faded wallpaper. The air inside was stale, as if it hadn't been touched in decades. On the floor was a single wooden chair, its paint chipped and peeling. Resting on the chair was a porcelain doll, its face cracked, its glass eyes staring blankly at the doorway. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She stepped back, slamming the door shut and wedging a piece of furniture against it. That night, she barely slept. Every creak of the house set her nerves on edge. The next morning, she convinced herself she was overreacting. It was just an old room, forgotten like so much of the house. She decided to focus on her renovations, avoiding the attic entirely. But the knocking returned. Every night, it grew louder, more insistent, and with it came the whispers. Faint, unintelligible voices that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Sarah tried to ignore it, but her nerves were fraying. She started waking up with scratches on her arms, bruises on her legs, as if something had been clawing at her while she slept. One night, unable to take it anymore, she went back to the attic. She brought a hammer and flashlight, determined to rip the door off its hinges and put an end to whatever was happening. But when she got there, the door was gone. In its place was a solid wall, the same as the rest of the attic. She stared at the space where the door had been, her mind racing. She wasn't imagining it. She couldn't be. She backed away, tripping over a loose floorboard. When she looked up, she saw the doll. It was sitting in the middle of the attic floor, its cracked face turned toward her. Before she could scream, the lights went out, plunging the attic into darkness. The whispers grew louder, surrounding her, filling her head. And then came the laughter. High-pitched and childlike, it echoed through the attic, growing louder and louder until it was deafening. Sarah stumbled down the stairs, nearly falling in her haste to escape. She ran out of the house, her flashlight the only source of light as she fled into the night. She never went back. The house remains abandoned to this day, but locals say strange things happen whenever someone gets too close. They hear knocking, faint and rhythmic. They hear whispers, just beyond the edge of understanding. And sometimes, late at night, they see a pale face staring out of the attic window, a porcelain doll watching and waiting.
Story number 8.
Darren had grown up hearing stories about the woods behind his grandmother's house. She always warned him to stay out of them, especially after dark. "There's something in there," she'd say, her voice trembling. "Something that doesn't belong." As a kid, Darren had always believed her, but now at 25, he dismissed her warnings as superstitious nonsense. He had returned to the old house to clean it out after his grandmother's passing, and the woods no longer seemed threatening, just dense, quiet, and endless. On his second night in the house, Darren heard a noise. It was faint at first, barely audible over the creaks of the old house. But as he sat in the living room sorting through boxes, the sound grew louder. A soft, high-pitched whistling. He froze, his hand hovering over a stack of papers. The sound wasn't coming from inside the house. It was outside, somewhere in the woods. Curiosity got the better of him. Grabbing a flashlight, Darren stepped onto the back porch, the cool night air prickling his skin. The whistling continued, melodic and haunting, coming from somewhere deep in the forest. "Hello?" he called out. His voice felt small, swallowed by the trees. No answer. The whistling stopped. The silence that followed was oppressive, thick and unnatural. Darren stood there for a moment, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness before shaking his head and heading back inside. That night, he dreamed of the woods. In the dream, he was walking along a narrow path, the trees closing in around him. The air was cold, and the only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath his feet. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. A pale figure, impossibly thin and hunched, standing between the trees. Its skin was gray, almost translucent, and its eyes were sunken black pits. It didn't move. It just watched him. When Darren woke, his heart was racing, his sheets soaked with sweat. He shook off the dream, chalking it up to stress. But the next night, the whistling returned. This time, it was closer. Darren tried to ignore it, pulling a pillow over his head, but the sound seeped into his thoughts, relentless and hypnotic. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore. Clutching the flashlight, he stepped outside, brazen following the sound. The whistling led him to the edge of the woods, where the trees loomed like silent sentinels. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice trembling. The whistling stopped. The silence was deafening, and Darren suddenly felt exposed, as if dozens of unseen eyes were watching him. He took a step back, ready to retreat to the safety of the house. That's when he saw it, the pale figure from his dream, standing just beyond the first row of trees. It was taller than he'd imagined, its limbs unnaturally long, its head cocked at an odd angle. Its skin glowed faintly in the moonlight, and its mouth was stretched into a grotesque grin, revealing rows of sharp, uneven teeth. Darren stumbled backward, the flashlight shaking in his hand. "Stay back," he shouted, though his voice cracked with fear. The thing didn't move. It just stared at him, unblinking. Then, slowly, it raised one spindly arm and pointed deeper into the woods. The whistling started again, louder now, coming from all around him. Darren's breath caught in his throat as he realized there were more of them, dozens of pale figures emerging from the trees, their dark eyes fixed on him. He turned and ran, the sound of the whistling following him all the way back to the house. When he slammed the door shut, the sound stopped. For the rest of the night, Darren sat in the living room with every light on, clutching a knife he'd found in the kitchen. He didn't sleep, too afraid to close his eyes. In the morning, he packed his things and left, abandoning the house to whatever lived in the woods. He never spoke of what he saw, but years later he heard a news report about the area. Hikers had gone missing, and locals claimed to hear strange whistling at night. Darren turned off the TV and locked every door and window in his apartment. But sometimes, in the dead of night, he swore he could still hear it. A soft, high-pitched whistling just outside his window.
Story number 9.
The Thing in the Mirror. Jess was renting a tiny, old apartment in the heart of the city. It wasn't much, just a single bedroom, a cramped kitchen, and a bathroom that always smelled faintly of mildew, but it was affordable, and that was all she cared about. The one thing she didn't like was the mirror. It hung in the hallway outside the bathroom, its frame ornate but tarnished, its glass slightly warped. No matter how much Jess cleaned it, the surface always seemed smudged, as if someone had run their fingers across it in the dead of night. Still, she tried not to think about it. One night, after a long shift at work, Jess came home, threw her keys on the counter, and collapsed onto the couch. She dozed off almost immediately, but a noise jolted her awake. It was faint, like the sound of fingernails tapping on glass. Jess sat up, her heart pounding. The room was silent, the only light coming from the street lamp outside her window. She told herself it was nothing and went to the kitchen for a glass of water. As she walked past the mirror, she saw it. A shadow moved across the glass. Jess froze, staring at her reflection. The hallway behind her was empty, but she could have sworn she saw something. A figure, tall and thin, sliding out of view. She laughed nervously, shaking her head. "Get a grip, Jess," she muttered, taking her water back to the couch. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. Over the next few nights, things got worse. Jess started waking up to find the mirror fogged over, as if someone had been breathing on it. Once, she found smudges, handprints, too large to be her own, pressed into the glass. She tried covering the mirror with a sheet, but the next morning, the sheet was on the floor, and the glass was clear, as if daring her to look. One night, she decided she'd had enough. Armed with a hammer, Jess stood in front of the mirror, her reflection trembling as much as she was. "This is my house," she said aloud, more to herself than to whatever might be listening. She swung the hammer, shattering the glass into 1,000 tiny shards. For a moment, she felt relief. But then she saw it. In the broken pieces of the mirror, her reflections stared back at her. All of them. Hundreds of tiny versions of herself, reflected in the shards on the floor. But they weren't moving like she was. They were grinning. One by one, the reflections began to twist, their features distorting into something inhuman. Their eyes darkened, their mouths stretched wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. Jess stumbled back, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She heard laughter, soft at first but growing louder, filling the room. She ran out of the apartment, not stopping until she was on the street, her hammer still clutched in her hand. The next day, she returned with a friend to collect her things, but the mirror was gone. So was the laughter. But every now and then, Jess catches her reflection in a window or a puddle, and she swears it moves just a little too late. And sometimes, it smiles.